On the surface, the room looked like a celebration. A dozen arrangements lined the mahogany table, white roses dusted with osmanthus petals, ribbons tied with precise bows, a cake iced in glossy cream that caught the ceiling light like a small moon. Cameras, mute and polite, angled toward the man who should have been the center of it all. Reporters had been promised footage. The board had been instructed to clap at the exact cue. Yet, as Shang Shixu took his seat, the applause felt like a trained echo, polite but detached, like servants performing gratitude for an absent master. He noticed everything. The way the chairman hesitated before offering his hand, the way a junior executive kept his phone in plain view as if open to an urgent screen. He watched a woman from a rival consortium avoid looking at him as she accepted a glass of champagne. People had learned how to be near him and how to be distant at the same time. That distance, measured in half smiles and guarded sentences, sat heavy on his chest. There was a hollow, private corner inside every privilege he'd earned, the kind of loneliness money could not upholster. It had crept up over the years, patient and slow, until he could no longer tell where calculated reserve ended and genuine isolation began. On his desk that morning, beside the customary ledger of acquisitions and the framed charity photo, he had left a small paper fortune from a temple stall the size of a coin. He had forgotten to return the talisman to the drawer. It lay face up, its ink faded by handling, and when a faint scent of osmanthus drifted into the boardroom, someone's perfume perhaps, he was briefly transported to a kitchen that smelled of sugar and flour and someone's earnest, clumsy attempts at warmth. The cake remained untouched on its silver platter. Servers circled with trays, but the cake was a prop that no one actually wanted to be near. It was an emblem, not an offering, a glossy symbol of felicitation that had been carefully rehearsed, documented, and already rendered safe by protocol. When company lawyers and PR directors assemble, they can script an image of joy as effectively as they can conceal a scandal. Today, their scripts were held together by thin lines and glassy smiles. Shang sat through the ceremony the way one reads an obituary for an idea. Polite eyes, measured responses, a mind cataloging each absence. There were no men at his side with real warmth, those who might have risked being candid or foolish enough to be sincere. He had become a monument, admired and avoided. Somewhere, a junior board member whispered about a bid that had quietly evaporated. Another spoke of a shareholder's unease. Names were mentioned in the same breath as numbers, as if the humanness behind them could be discounted out of a ledger. These were business decisions phrased as concern, but they were exclusionary at their core. Shang sat through the ceremony the way one reads an obituary for an idea. Polite eyes, measured responses, a mind cataloging each absence. There were no men at his side with real warmth, those who might have risked being candid or foolish enough to be sincere. He had become a monument, admired and avoided. Somewhere, a junior board member whispered about a bid that had quietly evaporated. Another spoke of a shareholder's unease. Names were mentioned in the same breath as numbers, as if the humanness behind them could be discounted out of a ledger. These were business decisions phrased as concern, but they were exclusionary at their core. They spoke to a larger erosion that had started long before this morning, the slow, polite sidelining of a man whose private life had become corporate risk. He had expected, in some private corner of his mind, at least a note, a card, a token that acknowledged his existence beyond the company email. But the one card he had received came wrapped in corporate letterhead and contained words he'd heard too many times: formal gratitude, thanks for leadership, a neat line about continued synergy. Even the words were careful not to touch him. He would later tell himself that he had grown accustomed to being staged like this. The solitude felt familiar, in the way a room with too many photographs feels familiar. Decorated, documented, but no one living in it. The ache that swelled under his collarbone was not new. He had learned to catalog it like any other asset. What was new was the quiet conviction that all of that scripting had flattened the edges of his life. He had authority, but the human replies he'd hoped for had become rare, like rain in a drought. Across town, at a narrow apartment above a bakery, Wen Nuan moved with a practiced economy that belied how little she had slept. Her hands smelled of butter and sugar. The bowl by her side had been washed 3 times that night. On the countertop, a small stack of boxes bore hurried labels and the faint smear of flour that mouthed silent evidence of long, invisible work. She wrapped each scone in paper, folding the edges as carefully as if she were making an offering. Her fingers trembled once when she noticed a shallow red line, the trace of a burn along the right index. She had wrapped it that morning with a small cloth, and the bandage now peeked out under her glove. The burn was a small, visible testament to every small risk she kept taking for her father. The scar of it would have been nothing to the surgical ledger or the cold efficiency of insurance, but it mattered to her in the way intimate wounds matter to people trying to stitch a life back together. Wen Nuan had never wanted to be famous. She questioned the word stand-in the day it was pinned on her like a badge of convenience. The marriage arrangement had been simple in the way of desperate things. In return for the legal veneer of a family tie, her father's name would be elevated enough to regain access to a specialist. The contract had been clean and brutal. Dates, clauses, formal limits. Love, in the fine print, had been marked as optional. She had signed it because she had to. She had stayed because obligations have a gravity of their own. In private, her gestures had become a language. A box of scones for a boardroom snack, a soup simmered for a sick night, a talisman bought on a rainy afternoon at a temple stall and handed over with a half smile. Maybe this will make things smoother. She had learned to make small acts carry weight. They were cheap currency she could spend when lamps burned out and hospital bills stacked like small, patient wrecks. She did not know how to acquire affection except through usefulness, so she practiced usefulness like prayer. She shelled cash for late-night labs, sold a pendant that had once been a birthday gift, and took work twice as hard so that she could pay someone to sit by her father's bedside when she could not. In the gaps between commitments, she wrote the face of a man she barely understood in a corner of her mind. The man who would sit in the mahogany room and watch a cake cool without touching it. Sometimes the thought of him felt like a private bruise. She had not expected to be noticed. The culture that labeled her stand-in had a way of refusing to see what it considered temporary. They reserved their curiosity for those with titles and histories and categories. She had none of those markers. This anonymity protected her in some ways and wounded her in others. That morning before dawn, she had risen to bake. The bakery ovens wore the new day like a kind of prayer of heat. She had learned to move in the space between opening and official counters. The scones she had folded were a recipe passed down by her mother, a dense, slightly sweet thing meant to be broken and eaten with other people. She remembered her mother's hands, the way they had shaped dough with a touch like both kindness and command. Wen Nuan found comfort in repetition, cream, flour, pinch of salt, until the world condensed into tasks she could complete. She thought once, in a quiet hour, whether this smallness would ever be seen, whether any of these gestures would be recognized for what they were, attempts to knit a life when the larger fabric refused to hold her. Back in the boardroom, Shang found himself noticing one small, absurd detail, a faint smear of flour on a junior executive's sleeve as he shifted the tray of refreshments. It registered the way a whispered confession would. The body language around him said they were keeping their distance, but the flower said someone had come from a kitchen, had carried something from one place to another. It punctured the ceremony with an odd human punctuation. His mind slid backward, unbidden, to the memory of a warm bowl of broth offered to him in a hospital corridor months earlier. Perfect healing soup, someone had called it half-jokingly. He had remembered the steam curling up, the way the broth settled in his bones. He had, without thinking, reached for the paper talisman in his pocket and rubbed the faded characters between his thumb and forefinger. It was dangerous, the way small details could act as bridges. They led you back to people. People led to complications. Complications led to errors in judgment. He had made many such errors in the name of protecting the company and the people in it. Sometimes his protectionist instincts tasted like ownership. Sometimes they tasted like fear. When his hand brushed the talisman again, there was an involuntary memory of a woman's hand, warm, slightly flower-dusted, placing such a charm into his palm. There were debts and favors owed in the margins of corporate life that could not be consolidated. He felt the weight of obligations he had delineated and the ones that had happened to find him anyway. A conversation in the corner grew louder. A young analyst was arguing for caution. "If they pull the bid," he said, "we'll have to restructure again. The board will—" The rest dissolved into the room's noise, and Shang's attention narrowed to a pinpoint. "You have me doing my job," he said softly when he left later that afternoon. The sentence no longer meant for the room. That's sufficient. Yet the line between job and life had been porous long before he set that boundary. The people he trusted were the ones who would have the courage to tell him things he needed to hear, and the compassion to act when he couldn't. The people who actually cared were almost extinct in his orbit. Outside the company towers, stories spread faster than the truth. The rumor mills preferred certainty to nuance. Someone had seen Wen Nuan selling a bracelet from a now empty velvet box in a second-hand shop. Someone else had seen her at a hospital kiosk. Each observation was a shard aimed at the narrative they all wanted to tell. This marriage was a performance. The woman was a decoy. The man was culpable by proximity. For Wen Nuan, the privacy of her work was a fragile treasure. She had learned to move between stations, kitchen, hospital, apartment, with the agility of someone keeping too many small, vital things from collapsing. When her father had been first diagnosed with leukemia, the word had landed on everyone like an immovable fact. It had not felt like sorrow in the beginning. It felt like logistics, appointments, calls, tests that produced long lists of unknowns. The hospital staff valued accuracy, consent forms, and the slow choreography of matching marrow. There were protocols, forms, waiting rooms designated by letters and numbers. The problem had neither romance nor villainy at first. It existed simply and terribly in the small action of blood tests. Wen Nuan had sat through each appointment with a stoicism people mistook for composure. She sold a family locket to pay the fee for a specialist's assessment. She took extra hours at the bakery in the early gray to offset the mounting payments. She had been given a list of donors to contact, a map of possible matches and their likelihoods. The doctors, kind but constrained by procedure, told them plainly what needed to be done. They explained the process of a bone marrow transplant with the clinical calm of someone describing mechanical repair. There would be matching, there would be consent. The window for treatment would be narrow but real. When no immediate match had been found, she felt an animal panic, then a cool calculation. Money could not manufacture a genetic compatibility, but it could buy time, closer consultations, access to registries, sometimes the ability to travel to different centers of medicine. She had made the numbers of this life her private math. Sell this, mortgage that, borrow from friends with interest that would be paid later in gestures. She learned to count the difference between what a bank valued and what a daughter valued. Numbers became sacrifices arranged like flowers before a small altar. In the quiet hours when the city slept, Wen Nuan crafted a plan built of fragments: contact registries, post appeals, ask for tests. She would not beg in public. She had too much pride and not enough time. So instead, she worked, and she allowed small acts, tucking an extra biscuit into her father's bag, adjusting his blanket, to be the measure of what she could still do. Those acts kept her sane. They kept her moving. When society demanded narratives, they offered one: the poor woman who married into power to save a parent. They wanted the neat arc: suffering, noble sacrifice, eventual rescue. But Wen Nuan's days were not narrative-friendly. They were chores and paperwork and quiet indignities. A cousin's sharp remark about standing in at an alumni reception, a relative asking whether the arrangement meant she had sold her dignity. Humiliation attached itself to her like lint. People who had no idea what it felt like to be in her shoes were suddenly very eager to offer moral judgment. Once, at a charity gala where she had been introduced as Shang's wife in a flow of reserved applause, an elder matriarch of the Guo family had taken the microphone and offered a blessing that carried the weight of accusation. "We must all make sacrifices for the greater good," she said, eyes gliding like a blade. "But the forms of sacrifice tell us where our loyalties lie." It was a rhetorical blessing, insidious, sharp. Wen Nuan had felt the room tilt beneath her. That evening she had returned home with fingers smelling faintly of citrus and stale coffee, and she had baked late into the night to push the wounding words down into a rhythm of work. Shang had watched from afar during such events. He had caught the edge in the matriarch's voice and the way Wen Nuan's shoulders tightened, and he had felt the tug to respond. But his response tended to be the quieter, more strategic sort: a reassignment of a contract, a defended paragraph in a press release, a late-night directive to a legal team. Actions were his language. They were measured, controlled, and often invisible. It was safer that way. Yet safety had a cost. Each time he shielded her with policy or indirect restitution, he added a layer to the performance he had hired: protection that became distance. There had been moments, though, when protection felt like fidelity. He remembered a rainy night when Wen Nuan had stayed at the hospital until 3 a.m., steam from a paper cup of tea fogging her glasses. He had arrived unannounced with an umbrella, and she had looked up with that small, tired smile. "You didn't have to come," she had said, as if he was intruding on her private currency of care. He had stood in the doorway and watched the steady rhythm of her patience. That night, without any public permutation, he had learned how to be grateful for the mundane things she did. Gratitude is private. It does not translate well to press releases. But gratitude alone could not keep the press at bay or the board appeased. Business is a species of hunger that does not honor human gestures. Rumors flared and sucked oxygen from carefully laid strategies. A competitor used an old accusation as leverage. A cousin of a board member leaked a photo of Wen Nuan paying at a pawn shop. A whisper campaign insinuated that the board's tolerance of the marriage would reflect on their own judgment. The company responded not with statements of moral courage, but with defensive retractions. Bids dissolved into thin air, and there were fewer hands willing to grasp the extended reach of his empire. Shang felt the creep of exile in the language of allies. Where there had been robust debate, there was now a calculus of risk. Where there had been the casual intimacy of private jokes and shared late dinners, there was now a new, brittle politeness. He saw it in the silence when his name was spoken. He saw it in the way partnerships were reevaluated, as if affection might be contagious. The more the world eroded toward caution, the more he performed certainty. He increased airport security, approved contingency plans, and authorized publicity campaigns to reclaim narrative. The motions were effective in headlines, but they could not alter the private ache of absence. He had bought himself fewer nights with people who could see him without filters. There was an absurdity in all of this theater. The longer he built walls, the less he found anyone willing to scale them honestly. Those who stayed were cautious. Those who left did so with the plausible deniability of investors. He had once thought authority would deliver companionship. Instead, it had leased him a series of associations, each fragile as paper. A week before his birthday, a simple incident made the depletion visible. In the middle of a routine press briefing, a junior partner asked a question about the company's commitment to social responsibility versus an anecdote they had recently read online. The question was framed as a legitimate inquiry, but carried the underlying bias of their peers. The chairman offered a rehearsed paragraph about charitable initiatives while a camera panned to capture the leader's solemn face. In that breath, a section of the room began to drift away. It was easy by then to read a quiet desert in his future if he didn't act to reclaim the human ground he had abandoned. Wen Nuan, in spite of it all, kept living in small acts. She left a bowl of perfect healing soup at his office once, without fanfare. The soup traveled in a paper container, nothing grand, and a note pinned to it read, "For your long night, W." It was a simple thing, and she thought nothing would come of it. But the aroma had condensed his defenses for an afternoon. He had eaten, though awkwardly, and later admitted that the warmth of the broth had allowed him to sleep. Those moments, like salt on an open wound, were specific and necessary. They didn't mend his empire, but they momentarily displaced his fortress into a human conversation. They were reminders that life could be tender if someone was willing to be clumsy and brave enough to offer it. The nights grew shorter as the calendar turned toward his birthday. He started to wonder whether the day would be another footnote in a private list of disappointments. Would the cake be a prop? Would the applause be a scripted cadence? He examined the forthcoming day as if it were a business risk, but between the margins of risk and strategy, he felt the sneaky tug of hope, an odd personal hope that the day might torpedo the isolation he had performed for so long. Hope is a complicated asset. It requires vulnerability to trade on it. On the edge of that hope, Wen Nguyen held two choices. She could step away from her stand-in role, take her father's fragile progress back into the private life she had left behind, or she could double down, make one more small sacrifice to buy more time. Either decision would be watched, interpreted, and weaponized by others. Either decision could change how people framed the marriage. The afternoon before the celebration, an event shifted the geometry of both of their lives. A break-in at the apartment above the bakery had been reported early in the morning. It was not a dramatic heist. Rather, it was the clumsy work of opportunists who had taken advantage of a mislatched window. A box of her scones, the day's meager profits, and a small velvet pouch containing the last of a sold necklace were gone. The theft felt like an insult multiplied. The removal of resources, the erasure of evidence of her labor, the small public breach of her private economy. She felt violated in a way that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the fragile dignity of making ends meet. The police were helpful, polite, and methodical in the way institutions are. "We will file a report," they said, taking notes. "It may be traced, but there are no guarantees." Wen Nguyen watched the officer fold his hands and kiss the absence of urgency with the formal language of routine. A small, important thing was gone, and the universe, in administrative response, had the tone of someone speaking about lost umbrellas. Word of the theft traveled faster than she expected. A cousin forwarded a message with a tone that suggested judgment. "What were you doing out so late?" it read. There was pity disguised as necessity. In the margins, there were those who would twist the narrative to fit the greater scheme, narratives that always preferred a clear villain to complex truth. When Shang heard of the break-in through a private message from his assistant, his body registered a different kind of friction. He could have sent security to sweep the neighborhood or hired a fleet of investigators to chase leads, but he understood, in the same small way he understood the sediment beneath his empire, that some protections would only underscore an inequality he did not wish to amplify publicly. He called her instead and stood outside in the cold until she answered. He did not offer surveillance. He offered a small, immediate thing, a ride to the station and a hand to hold the box of evidence. It was not grand, it was inconvenient and slightly messy, and, in its modesty, dangerously human. She accepted, but on the phone he could hear her breathing as if she were counting the cost of every kindness. "I'm fine," she said, a phrase more accustomed to survival than comfort. "Don't worry about it." There were more complicated currents under the theft. The Gu matriarch saw an opening, a story of vulnerability that could be converted into social leverage. A rival quietly circulated rumors that the break-in had more to do with her lack of social ties than with petty criminality. The city liked a tidy explanation: the woman who melts in the face of adversity, the man who stands apart. Both of these simplified versions fit comfortably into the headlines that would follow. As night deepened, Wen Wen stewed a pot of the perfect healing soup, more from impulse than a thought-out plan. She could not bear the rawness of it, and she needed the motion. While the broth simmered and aromatics released that faint maternal comfort, she wrapped another set of scones left over from the morning's batch. They were homely, imperfect, and the dough had split in a small place where she had rushed the fold. She thumbed the paper and sealed the box with a strip of tape borrowed from the bakery's supply. The action steadied her. There was, tucked into her apron pocket, a small talisman, one she had picked up months earlier from a temple stall, the same kind of charm that had once been placed in Shang's palm. It was frayed, and its ink was dull from being handled. She had never given it much thought beyond its superstition. Tonight, she touched it as if it might offer permission for something she had not yet named. She thought, briefly and feverishly, about presenting it to him, not as proof of devotion, not as an admission of anything beyond the careful, practiced things she did, soup, scones, talisman, but as a human crossing of a line that had been both professional and personal. If someone were to see her hand offering something small and sincere, the world might encounter a truth harder to ignore than any attorney's memo. A simple act had a peculiar moral geometry. It could change how people saw an entire story. She felt the weight of possibility like the hush before a tide. Shang, a few floors above the city's light, sat at his desk and looked at the calendar marked with meetings and lists. Someone had placed his birthday schedule in his inbox with the automated precision of a publicist. There was an hour at noon carved out for the ceremony, and a private dinner that night that had been provisioned with guests of convenience. He thought about declining the dinner and spending the evening in his office, the way he had done for years, alone with a file lamp for company. The idea of canceling felt like admitting defeat, yet the thought of continuing with a parade of performative affection felt equally unbearable. Between the two of them, the leak of rumor, the theft, the fragile economy of family health, and the brittle courtesy of corporate allies were assembling like a chain of small decisions that could either break or bind them. Someone would have to choose first to let authenticity risk exposure. Wen Nguyen wrapped the scones and slid them into the small box. The burn on her finger throbbed in a way that kept her mindful. She tied the box with string, then placed the talisman on top as if it were a name card. She considered leaving them at the company as an anonymous gift the next morning. She considered presenting it directly. She imagined the pity in the room if it were anonymous, and she imagined the hostility if it were public. She imagined the way an unguarded moment could be reframed into headlines. Outside, Shang finished his last meeting, excused himself, and walked the long way home. The city that night seemed emptied of ease, buzzing softly under the weight of 1,000 small worries. He thought of the talisman in his drawer, the bowl of soup that had warmed him once, the the small things that seemed to slip through the formal world unnoticed, yet held the capacity to disarm him. The next day would be his birthday. 1,000 small currents collided at that thin seam between anticipation and dread. He could ruin it with strategy, or he could let it reveal the truth of the people who move around him. She could step forward with a cup of soup and a box of scones and a talisman and risk the world's interpretation. Or she could stay where she had always been, useful, invisible, protective of the private economy she had carved out of necessity. At midnight, after he had gone to bed with the city's promises still cooling on his forehead, and she had slept for an hour over a fragrant bowl of soup, both of them dreamt their own small version of reunion. He dreamt of a room where the cake was actually eaten, crumbs on the table. She dreamt of a day when her father received the news he needed to stay. Dreams, like talismans, have a slippery currency. They promise more than they can guarantee. A thin light showed under the door of her apartment as dawn loosened the night. She stood for a moment, hand on the doorknob, the box of scones and the talisman heavy in her other. Her thumb brushed the bandage at the burn, and the movement startled a tiny sting. She closed her eyes to the city and breathed in. Osmanthus or exhaust, it was hard to tell, the scent of early morning. For a moment, the world narrowed to the small box and the question of whether she would risk visibility. If she brought it in, people would watch. If she stayed away, the day would go on, scripted and safe. She tugged her glove over her hand and tucked the box under her arm. The decision had the weight of small defiance. She put the key in the door, and for the first time in months, she felt something like an answer rise in her chest, the possibility that a minor, sincere action might alter the pattern of a life carefully staged for control. If you're with us, stay. There is a small, honest thing coming that will change a room and perhaps a heart. She arrived just as the room had reached the thin, rehearsed applause that marks the end of a speech written by committee. The boardroom felt colder than it had looked in photographs. Less gleam, more glass. Less warmth, more angle. Someone had gone to the trouble of placing a ribbon around the silver cake platter, as if a bow could reattach sincerity. When one kept to the margins at the doorway, the box of scones tucked under her arm, and the talisman folded in a corner of her palm like a private slip of paper. The bandage on her finger peeked from beneath her glove, a small irregularity against the formal dress code. For a moment, she considered stepping back into anonymity, slipping the box onto a sideboard and walking away. It would have been safer. It would have been a way to keep the private math of sacrifice to herself. But the box felt heavier at that thought, suddenly an offering she could not make anonymous without losing its meaning. The scones were not simply pastries. They were the days she had risen before dawn, the hours she had traded for hospital bills, the evenings she had bent over a tub of soup to coax comfort into a bowl. The talisman was not a superstition. It was the memory of tiny favors and a shorthand for every small mercy they'd offered each other when ceremony threatened to erase personhood. A security guard stepped toward her with polite suspicion. His badge blinked, and he mouthed, "May I help you?" She had rehearsed 1,000 replies in the taxi on the way over, anonymity, charity, for the staff, but when she opened her mouth, the words that came were not planned. "These are for Mr. Shang," she said simply, "for his birthday." Her voice was small but level. The guard looked past her, saw the polished table and the man at its head, who seemed, at that moment, almost as staged as the cake. He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll let them know." Inside, the air shifted fractionally. People registered the movement of a presence they had not accounted for, like a cursor appearing on a document. Cameras glanced toward the doorway, not always out of curiosity, but because anything new must be cataloged. For many, the newness meant gossip, an opportunity to shape the day's narrative. For Shang, whose attention had been numbed by rehearsed politeness, it registered as a small rupture. He almost did not notice who it was at first. The face at the doorway was familiar in a way that belonged to memory rather than public relations. And then, like a key finding the right lock, the name fit. Wen Duan walked to the table with the measured speed of someone who had learned the economy of presence. Not too fast to be noticed as discomposure, not too slow to be judged. When she crossed the threshold, the room exhaled variously, some with polite attention, some with the discreet narrowing of eyes that say, "I'll judge before I hear." The chairman rose. The photographer tensed. She felt the weight of that look as acutely as she'd felt the weight of loans in a ledger. She set the box down in front of Shang, and before anyone could cue the expected publicity, she unfolded her gloves to place the talisman beside it. Her fingers were careful. The bandage flashed like a counterpoint to the curated smoothness of the room. Wen Duan looked at him. Looked, not at the sculpted image of a leader, but at the man who'd once accepted a bowl of soup with a reluctant, private gratitude. "Happy birthday," she said. The words were plain. There were no prepared sentiments, no press-ready lines. They landed in the room like a small, simple thing that had no use for gloss. The moment cracked something inside the rehearsed ceremony. Shang's mouth went slightly slack. For a breath, he remembered the heat of ovens at dawn, the smell of butter and flour clinging to a collar as if that scent could stitch a wound closed. He smelled, in that thin, corporate air, a thread of osmanthus, the same faint note that had tied some of his private memories to hers, and something in his chest loosened. There was an immediate clamor. A board member coughed. A PR assistant whispered. But it was not the kind of noise formed by strategy. It was the sound of real life, surprise, embarrassment, the scratch of a chair. Some guests smiled stiffly, others lowered their gaze. The cameras, which had been prepared to capture a staged edible symbol, pivoted to record a different truth. A woman offering a box of home-baked scones and a talisman to a man who had just been ceremonially honored by people who would rather not look whole. Shang stood, and the room shifted with him. The rehearsed speech he had kept on his lap was suddenly obsolete. He had, for weeks, perfected the way to accept congratulations without allowing them to become intimate. Today, the practiced armor slipped. He felt the old, private ache. He felt, more urgently than he had allowed himself to feel in public for years, the recognition of being seen by a hand that had known him without the safety of a press release. He reached for the box with fingers that trembled. "Thank you," he said, but the phrase was small and real and nearly broke. His voice had a texture to it that didn't belong to the speechwriter. It belonged to a man. "Thank you, Wen Duan." Her name landing in his mouth snapped at something else. Old restraint, brittle etiquette, the contractual terms they'd both lived inside for too long. The chairman cleared his throat, halfway toward a recovery. The cameras skipped awkwardly between corporate protocol and the human moment unfolding. Some in the room tried to recast it. A lovely gesture, personal warmth. But the smallness of the offering undercut the usual machinery of spin. Real human things resist easy translation. Wen Duan's eyes met his and stayed there. She did not bow or put on airs. She did not apologize for being human. She simply held his gaze for a breath, as if to say, in the quietest possible way, "I am here." It was a simple enough scene, and yet in the thrust of it lay the potential for a kind of unarmored truth that the room had not permitted itself in a long time. Cameras recorded the tenderness, phones pinged with live updates, whispers changed tone. The scene reframed the narrative. The man who had been curated and isolated, the woman who had been explained away as accessory or problem, now existed in contrary light, connected, accountable, human. For Shang, the gesture was not merely a puncture of the corporate veil, it was a mirror. It forced him into a kind of accounting he could no longer outsource to executives and counsel. He felt suddenly like the man who had once approached a hospital corridor with a paper bowl of broth and been surprised by the warmth it gave him. His throat tightened. He set the box aside and, without the filter of a PR memo, spoke into the small silence that fell. "I don't know how to say this properly," he began, and his admission, awkward, unfinished, was itself a presence. "But I want people to know I appreciate what this means, not as a symbol, but for what it is." The chairman shifted, the corporate plan slipping. A faction at the table bristled. Not everyone was ready to have their narrative undone. Chang Wang's face, a study in measured opportunism, stayed carefully neutral, as if the scene were something he could incorporate into his ledger. The Gu matriarch's eyes narrowed. For them, the move from stage to substance was a liability. But for the people watching, security, assistants, the junior analyst who had been whispering about bids, the scene registered as a small but decisive one. The man who had been a monument to control was, for once, visibly changed by a personal act that asked nothing in return. What happened next could not be fully planned. The cameras continued to roll. The chairman made the formal offering of cake, but the slice moved now from ritual to something more private. Shang lifted a piece, and rather than address it to the room, he handed it to Wenwan first. It was an act small enough to be overlooked in any corporate manual and large enough to pull the room into a new alignment. "Will you—" he started, and then stopped, because language felt too cumbersome. He picked her hand with both of his, an awkward, sincere gesture that everyone would later debate in op-eds and gossip. For Wenwan, it was ridiculous and terrifying and oddly stabilizing. For him, it was an apology in a form he had not known how to make. "Sit with me at dinner tonight," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation that would be visible to all who were watching. It carried with it the implication of a different engagement than the contract they had signed. It implied presence. The room exhaled in various ways. Some people rose to applaud the moment as if it were a good piece of theater. Others sat, agitated by the breach of script. The cameras captured it all. For those whose livelihoods depended on optics, this new scene required recalculation. For the people who had heard the rumors and whispered about bids, it presented the inconvenient fact that people were not easily reduced to the stories others told about them. Outside the room, the ripples began immediately. Some partners called to confirm. Is this real? Investors re-evaluated not just numbers but personalities. Social media churned out two versions of the story, the humanizing interpretation and the cynical spin that saw the moment as a staged PR move. That latter narrative pleased the people who had something to gain by casting everything as performance. But the visceral honesty of Wenwan's offering made the staged narrative harder to sustain. The more pressing fallout arrived not in headlines, but in a different register. Assistant Fang, who had been suspicious of a number of board members, slid a file across to Shang's desk mid-afternoon, a thread of correspondence that suggested a conspiracy to leverage the marriage into corporate advantage. It referenced payments, meetings with a shadowy fixer, and a string of bribes. The fixer's name had been whispered in the underbelly of the city's deals, a broker in reputation and scandal. The file included surveillance photos from the week of the break-in at Wenwan's apartment, men in nondescript coats, a transaction at an out-of-the-way cafe, an envelope passed. Shang's jaw clenched as he read. He had suspected malice. He had seen how the Gu matriarch and certain board factions smelled opportunity in scandal. But to see the paper trail made the manipulation real. It wasn't only power politics, it was criminality orchestrated to erode a life. The theft of scones had been petty. The plan to turn that petty theft into a public assassination of a woman's dignity was not. He called attorney Zhang and asked for a discreet investigation. The attorney's face on the video call was all professional patience and a small, tightening smile. "If this is what it looks like," she said, "we need to move carefully. There are channels and there are consequences." The company's legal team had the atmosphere of people suddenly forced into a moral dimension they had preferred to keep tidy. Money can conceal many things, but not everything. The evidence that Assistant Fang had gleaned added weight to the pattern. There had been attempts to manufacture scandal, to redistribute blame, and to profit off the marriage's perceived weakness. It was not merely a social campaign, it was a strategy with teeth. Within 48 hours, there were arrests. Not of the matriarch, her social circle would protect her for a time, but of the fixer and several intermediaries. The police were careful and methodical, and their language had the strange, comforting bluntness of a world where certain wrongs are called what they are. Statements were taken. Names were given. The link between the fixer and an opportunistic faction inside the company's circle was clearer than any of the PR consultants had expected. Media outlets that had been gleeful in the initial gossip had to step back. A narrative that had been easy to sell was now legally entangled. Shang did not make a grand speech to the press. He did something less theatrically satisfying and more consequential. He opened the company's resources to help Wen Nuan secure proper legal protection and to support an investigation into who had sought to profiteer from her misfortune. He instructed the company to halt any bids or deals that hinged on leverage obtained through manufactured scandal. In public statements that were understated and surgical, he acknowledged that the company had been slow to defend the dignity of people associated with it, and he pledged to do better. Those quiet, procedural acts mattered as much as any speech. For Wen Nuan, they were proof that his words had weight, that his movement from scripted authority to human accountability would be backed by action. For others in the company, it signaled that a leader would accept a degree of reputational risk rather than sacrifice an individual for the sake of optics. Meanwhile, the medical arc, ever the harsh arithmetic between hope and reality, found its own more mundane momentum. After the theft and the arrests, Wen Nuan had found the presence to resume the campaign for her father's care with new, steadier support. The match that had been elusive reappeared in the registry logs. A volunteer donor, identified through a donor drive that Wen Nuan's small plea for tests campaign had inspired months earlier, had become available domestically after travel restrictions eased. The doctors explained that the match was not perfect in the hyperbolic sense. It was an appropriate HLA match that made a transplant medically viable. It required consent, careful timing, and weeks of preparation to manage both donor and recipient. The transplant process was rendered as a series of small, disciplined steps rather than a miraculous leap. Wen Nuan sat in the sterile hospital waiting room during the long pre-op days, where the mechanical hum of machines and the soft, repeated instructions of nurses were the most honest soundtrack to hope. The father underwent conditioning and tests, the donor was evaluated and cleared, the logistics, blood products, temporary housing, aftercare were coordinated. Shang's people arranged for expedited background checks and logistical support for the donor, but they did not circumvent protocol. There were forms and consent and the slow, boggling efficacy of medicine's checklist. On the day of the operation, Wen Nuan stood not in a room of cameras, but in a corridor full of blinds and antiseptic light. Shang did not attend the surgery room. Surgery was a place for professionals and family in a narrow alliance, but he was outside, pacing in the impersonal corridor, a man whose usual instruments of control were useless in the face of a scalpel. He felt like someone watching a different kind of ledger, of a body, not a balance sheet. He listened to the beep of monitors as if they were the counting of a new kind of currency. The operation succeeded in the technical terms the doctors used. The graft took, there were no immediate catastrophic complications, and the father entered the long, fragile arithmetic of convalescence. He would not be cured in a sentence. He would be a patient in recovery, monitored for infections, for graft versus host signs, for the small betrayals a body can make when it is reorganizing itself. The prognosis was hopeful but measured, and everyone understood that the next year would be a slow consolidation rather than a dramatic denouement. The arc of crime and medicine together made a different kind of currency for the city and for the company. The arrests and the transplant both landed like two distinct moral reckonings, one public and punitive, the other private and hopeful. They reframed the way people talked about the marriage and, more abstractly, about the obligations of those in power. In the wake of the arrests, the Gu matriarch's influence receded, not because a dramatic unmasking toppled her, but because the rot she had cultivated, opportunism, rumor-mongering, the weaponization of small cruelties, could not survive the glare of legal scrutiny and the practical, human insistence on dignity. She remained socially prominent for a while, of course. Reputation takes work to crumble. But the alliances that had once given her leverage began to pivot, and courtiers migrated toward a clearer-eyed stability. For Wen Nuan, the public attention was a mixed blessing. Suddenly, people who had never noticed her endurance were writing profiles that meant to humanize her, but in doing so stripped her of the privacy she had never requested and did not want. She kept the talisman in a drawer and wrapped the bandage on her finger with care. She accepted help for her father, but refused to be photographed in the hospital as if she were merely a symbol. She asked for, and received, space to be a daughter rather than a curiosity. Shang adjusted too. He found himself learning to speak not as a man who must always preserve face, but as a man who must sometimes risk face for moral clarity. He instituted changes in his own company, a policy on reputational ethics, an employee ombudsperson office, and a fund to subsidize medical needs for employees and families in crisis. It wasn't charity in the superficial sense. It was a structural commitment to the idea that a company could not be solely a place of transactions, but could hold obligation. This was not an overnight transformation of a man who had been solitary as a rule, but it was a visible, substantive step. There were moments of friction, of course. Some board members complained the moves were inefficient. A handful of investors murmured about brand risk. But the calculus of public sentiment and the logic of doing the right thing ultimately tipped the scales. The company's market metrics stabilized and then recovered. Not because good PR had been purchased, but because trust, fragile and slow to knit, had been partially restored by actual, accountable decisions. Between legal hearings and hospital ward rounds, there were other kinds of reckonings. Shang and Wen Nuan found themselves having late conversations that were no longer mediated by counsel or publicists. He apologized, clumsy, halting apologies that meant more because they were real. He acknowledged the ways his protection had sometimes become possession. He took responsibility for policies he had signed off on that had dehumanized her. She, in turn, voiced the things she needed from the relationship that a contract had never provided. Respect for her autonomy, the right to make decisions about her father's care without being made into a spectacle, and the space to be recognized as a person rather than an instrument. There was a sequence that mattered more than any public statement: the day he burned the contract. They met in the private library where corporate paperwork tended to pile in neat, dangerous towers. Wen Nuan did not ask for the gesture. She did not enjoy theatricality, but she recognized its symbolic efficacy. The contract had been a ledger of necessity. Burning it would not necessarily undo 2 years of habit and hardened expectations, but the act of destroying the paper felt like shedding a layer of armor. They signed a simple legal disclaimer that would provide Wen Nuan with independence in practice. She would retain certain protections and benefits without being subject to provisions that stripped her agency. The lawyers drafted language that was practical and fair. Then, in the quiet safety of an empty office, they burned the contract, an act witnessed by no one except an old janitor who pretended not to look and later said with a small smile that the room felt warmer afterward. For Wen Nuan, the burning was not a fairy tale ending. It was a punctuation. What had been necessary would no longer be compulsory. For Shang, it was a first, visible renunciation of a habit of control. Their reconciliation was not without difficulty. Wen Nuan made clear that she wanted independence, that she would not be a trophy figure whose presence was curated and sold. Shang accepted that she might choose someday to leave. He could not and would not demand that she stay. The honesty of that exchange changed the parameters of their relationship. It made future choices their own, no longer obligations inscribed by lawyers' ink. They learned to create small, domestic rituals that belonged to them outside of cameras and company dinners. Wen Nuan taught Shang the particular joy of splitting a scone down the middle and spreading a little preserved orange onto it. He learned to tolerate flour on his shirt and to laugh when he burned his finger at a stove. These were minor, ridiculous things in the ledger of a man's career, but they were priceless in the quiet accounting of a life. The city, always hungry for a tidy arc, later framed the change as a single, transformative moment, the box of scones presented at the boardroom table. The truth was more complicated. It had been a chain of decisions, some public and some invisible. The scones had been a hinge, not a miracle. They allowed the man who had been ignored by everyone to be seen, and being seen led him to act. His acts had consequences that were material: arrests, legal shifts, funding for care, a transplant scheduled and performed under appropriate medical protocols. Months later, after the transplant and the slow accrual of small recoveries, gradual weight gain, fewer late-night fevers, a cautious laugh from a man who had been pale and thin, there was a different kind of birthday. Not a staged corporate pageant, but a small dinner at Shang's apartment. Lights dimmed, a single cake on the table. The guests were few. The father, looking healthier but still fragile, a couple of attendants from the hospital who had become, in their practical intimacy, almost family, Attorney Zhang, who had become a trusted, steady voice, Assistant Feng, who had spent late nights stitching together threads of evidence, and a handful of company people whose loyalty had been tested and chosen. The cake had a dent from being carried too fast, frosting not perfectly smooth. Its imperfection was, oddly, more beautiful for that. The room smelled faintly of osmanthus candles. Someone had thought it fitting, and the talisman Wen Nun had placed on the sill caught the light. Shang sat beside Wen Nun, more relaxed than he'd been in public for a long time. He leaned forward, blew out the candle this time with a force that was more symbolic than necessary, and when he opened his eyes, the faces around him looked human rather than ornamental. He raised his glass. "To small things," he said, "to people who do small things." Wen Nun laughed softly, an honest, bright sound that had been rare in the months of stress. "To scones, definitely," she answered, and the room let itself be small and grateful. After the cake, when most guests had filtered away, the two of them lingered. The city was audible only as a distant hum. For a while, they made no promises. There was no rush to define the shape of the future. They spoke instead of practicalities, follow-up appointments, the father's physiotherapy schedule, the details of the foundation Shang planned to set up for medical aid. There was talk of an embryonic plan, a small fund that would support patients like Wen Nun's father who lacked resources but needed access to registered ethical care. It was not grandiose, it was structural. At some point, Shang reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, flimsy paper talisman, one of the ones he'd collected over the years in private. He smoothed it with his thumb and looked at Wen Nun with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I kept this," he said. "I shouldn't have, but I did." She took it from him with no ceremony and put it back in her pocket. "Keep one for yourself," she said, "if you need it." He smiled, a vulnerable gesture that looked like a concession and like joy at once. It was not the end of their struggles. There would be nights they'd disagree. There would be calls from investors who would try to assess risk. There would be the slow, watched recovery of a man whose life had been upended by disease. But in that small apartment, in the dented frosting of a cake, there was a different tenor to the world: humility, agency, and ongoing, earned trust. The public, predictably, sought a tidy amble from scandal to redemption. They got something messier and more convincing. A man who had been ignored by many finally recognized what it cost to be seen, and a woman who had been treated as an accessory decided, in view of that seeing, to demand respect and agency on her own terms. The scones became a symbol, unromantic and unglossed as real symbols ought to be. People liked a symbol they could understand: warmth, effort, the smell of baking. There were consequences yet to arrive in the formal world. Hearings about corporate governance forced more transparency. The fixer went to trial. Some reputations did not recover. But those things were not the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter was that the small, real act of giving had pierced a carefully constructed detachment and launched real, responsible change. On the first quiet morning after the birthday dinner, Wen Nuan returned to the bakery. She washed her hands beneath the tap, the scar on her finger almost faded, and reached into the pocket of her apron to touch the talisman she had kept. A few crumbs clung to her fingertips, evidence of the small victories she carried daily, and she smiled at them as if they were medals no one else would see. Across town, in his office, Shang opened a file that contained the initial proposal for the medical fund. He read the draft with a careful eye. It would provide grants, coordinate with ethical registries, and offer legal counseling to families who found themselves prey to rumor or coercion. He penned a note to Attorney Zhang. "Let's start small and do it right." He sent it without pretense. The decision felt like a new muscle in him. Action that was public, accountable, and vulnerable. Several weeks later, the father walked a few steps without the aid of a nurse, steady and cautious, and Wen Nuan filmed it on her phone. It was a short clip, a footstep, a laugh, a tear. She sent it to Shang with no caption. He watched it 3 times before replying, a single, honest emoji, and 2 words: "Good work." They were, in the end, ordinary acts that amounted to repair. There was no sudden erasure of the past. There was instead a series of admissions and changes and concrete steps toward restitution. Wen Nuan regained some of her social footing, not because of any dramatic marketing coup, but because the narrative of her as a mere accessory had been punctured by evidence of her endurance and agency. She kept the bakery in her life as a practical anchor. Shang did not insist. She did not ask to be pushed away. They shared chores sometimes, and she taught him how to fold dough with a patient, corrective hand. On a rainy afternoon months later, they walked home from the hospital together, their coats splashed with city weather, and passed a small temple stall where talismans were sold. An elderly vendor smiled at them as if he were in on a joke centuries old. Wen Nuan paused, and without thought, bought 2 talismans, one for her father, one for the office shelf. They were frayed and cheap, but they smelled faintly of incense and rain. That night, back in their kitchen, he tried his hand at baking for the first time. He burned his finger, predictably, and she laughed and wrapped it in a small plaster. It was the same burn she had once carried. The bandage was now a shared souvenir. She sat with him on the narrow counter, and they ate a scone that wasn't perfect. It crumbled in their hands. The imperfect pastry tasted of work and of mornings where things were not yet settled. It tasted like enough. When the city asked for a single line to sum it up, when Nuon later said in an interview she had agreed to do, her voice calm and steady, "No gesture can repair all harm, but a small act of sincerity can be the hinge that lets people choose to do the right thing," she added, privately to the camera, "and sometimes that's all a human being needs to begin again." On his next birthday, there was no staged ceremony. A few close friends came for dinner, and the cake this time was imperfect by design, a hand-frosted thing with uneven icing, a tiny smear of jam at the side. When Shang cut the cake, his hands were steadier. He placed a piece on Wen Nuan's plate and watched her face as she tasted it. He'd learned that some things could not be commanded into being, but required tending, patience, and sometimes the humility to accept warmth from an unpolished source. The talisman on the bookshelf caught the light in the evening. The scent of osmanthus came through a diffuser they had bought on an impulse, and for a few minutes, with the apartment smelling faintly of flowers and cake, the two of them sat close, hands touching, without pressure or contract. There were still hard days ahead, and there would be, in the future, moments where they would have to defend what they'd earned. But in that small domestic scene, there was a steady warmth that did not feel rehearsed. Outside, the company continued to operate with all the traffic of commerce. Inside, something quieter took root, a commitment to human accountability, the recognition that small acts could change the tenor of a life, and that power without empathy leaves people alone in rooms full of applause. The city, which loved spectacle, had briefly been offered something more durable, evidence that a leader could be made more humane by an act that cost almost nothing and meant everything. When Nuon's father continued his slow recovery, he learned to walk again with a cautious independence. The transplant had not been a fairy tale cure. It was a long project of monitoring and rehabilitation. But he gained weight, color returned, and laughter, once rare, came back in small increments. The family visited the hospital less frequently and learned to reclaim evenings for ordinary meals and small domestic arguments about who had left the kitchen light on. In the months that followed, the arrests wound through the justice system in a way that felt measured and necessary. Trial, testimony, sentencing, and the company established a new ethics board. It wasn't a perfect fix for a world that was sometimes cruel and uneven, but it signaled a new posture. Accountability was not optional. The story that began with a room full of people who were practiced at distance ended with a man who had his birthday table finally full in the way that matters, with people who chose presence rather than performance. It was not an instant redemption for anyone. It was an accumulation of small, honest acts. The box of scones was not the sole cause of change, but it was the hinge, the small, tactile offering that pierced a room of ritual and asked a man to be human. He answered, imperfectly and bravely. On the evening when they closed one chapter and began another, the cake was cut, the frosting scraped in places, specks of flour on the table, and the talisman sat in the middle like a quiet witness. Shang lifted his glass not to a curated image, but to a set of people who had endured and chosen to continue. When Nuon looked at him across the table and saw a man who had learned, painfully, that the work of care is structural and sustained. They ate the cake together, crumbs catching in the corners of their mouths, and for the first time in a long time, the sound of their laughter in the room was uncomplicated by optics. The city outside would, as always, press for a neat narrative. Their life would persist in its messy, human truth, small gestures, hard decisions, and the slow business of rebuilding trust. If this small act moved you, subscribe for more stories of second chances and the quiet power of honest gestures.